In this video, we're going to look at making a wooden plate. This is how the finished product looks like. See the rounded edges, we have a juice groove around it.
First, let's talk about the wood. You can use any wood you want. Softer wood is usually easier to work with than hardwood. I've used solid oak, as you can see. I got this from a local big box store. I just like the way this wood is when I work with it. But you can use pine or cedar. Those should be easier to work with. Once I got the wood at 8-foot lengths, I cut them into pieces that are just under a foot long. And since this wood is 10 inches wide, the plates will be about 10 inches tall and just under 12 inches wide, which seems like the right size for me. The next step after cutting the wood is to put the juice groove on it. I came up with this fixture and it seems to work really well for me. As you can see, we need an offset between the edge of the wood and the guiding edge for the router. You can decide on this width based on how far you want the groove from the edge of the wood. And so once I do that, I've got this setup here that I can use to hold the pieces together so it doesn't move. It doesn't have to be extremely tight as far as holding the wood down, because the router doesn't actually put a lot of force on the wood. But the key to make sure is that there are no gaps between any of these. That way the edge of the guiding edge is parallel to the edge of the plate that I'm cutting. And so once I snug it all up, center all these as well as I can, then I can snug it up together. And I've got myself a piece of wood that shouldn't move, and I should be able to do the router. It's also important to make sure that the height of these offset pieces is exactly the same as the height of the wood. That way when the router goes across, there is no step where it can catch on. It might be better to sand the corner so that there is a bit of a chamfer. If you make it lower than the wood, then the base plate of the router can rock as you go past the edge, and that's not a good thing either. The tool bit I used was a 1/2-inch round-nosed cutter. This is a long reach. I guess you could also use the regular round nosed end without the long reach, but this just worked better for me because I wanted the router to be able to plunge the way I wanted it. The next step is to round the corners. I cut a template where if I round the corner like that, the center of this arc would be the same as the center of the groove. I thought that would make it look nicer. So mark all the 4 corners. And then I'm going to use a bandsaw to cut them off before I'll sand them. You can use any saw that you have available. The next step is to sand the corners to make them smooth, and also all the edges. Keep in mind that the sanding has to happen along the grain. When it's the end grain, it doesn't matter what direction you use. In order to do the rounding of the edges, I used double-sided tape to glue a couple of pieces of wood. This way there is enough distance from the table so the tip of the cutter doesn't hit the table. You see, I had that problem and that's how I fixed it. I used material to keep the plate from sliding around. Also, when you do the routing, make sure that you go at a decent speed, otherwise I found that you burn the wood. I'm using a 3/8 inch cutter with a ball bearing end to it. Usually it's better to start on the edge that has the end grain and then work your way around and finish there. I also decided to round out the bottom edges, but this time I used a 1/8 inch. The last step before sanding and finishing is to cut the slots so that you can get your finger underneath the plate to lift it up. For that, I've used a router table. I have a stop here because as you plunge in to start the cut, the wood has the tendency to kick backwards. So you want to stop that. I've made a mark on the table to know where to stop. That way I get a consistent cut every time. To make the handles on the wooden plate, I used a 3/8 inch cove cutter in my router. When I finished routing the handle for picking up the plate, I noticed that there are some black spots that I had in some of the plates. When I did the router, I wasn't moving steadily all across from one end to the other. If I paused even for a momentarily, then the cutter was rubbing on the wood, causing the wood to burn. Now I have to figure out a way to get rid of these. I'm going to use handheld belt sander that I have. The final step in sanding is to use 120 grit paper and a sanding block. That's what I did to get the really smooth finish. Always make sure that you're sanding along the direction of the grain. When it comes to the end, of course, it doesn't matter because it's end grain. Once you're done sanding, the next step is to clean it really well. The temptation is to use a damp sponge. That's what I did at first, and the grain in the oak seems to swell even with a little bit of moisture, and makes the surface really rough. And even after it dries out, it doesn't get smooth again. So make sure to use a dry sponge and clean it. The last step, and the one that everybody likes, is to apply the finishing on the wood. For that, I've used Howard's Butcher Block Conditioner. It's got food grade mineral oil and natural waxes. I think the combination of oil and waxes is really good to seal the wood. As you can imagine, you cannot use varnish or any of those things. You really need to use something that's food grade. And the instruction says that you should apply 3 or 4 different applications. I've already done it twice, so it's already looking different. And I'll show you how you do the application. Just add a little bit on it, and then use some kind of a clean rag to wipe it. And wipe it generously, and let it soak, and then you wipe it off. After about 20 minutes is what the instruction says. Make sure to get the end grain part of it really well, because that's where the oil gets oil soaks up really well.